Today, it is a battle of red lines versus red lines, and I need not tell you that the line on the map is going to win. Red lines have become a bit of a meme with the war in Ukraine. Russia keeps putting them up, and the West keeps breaking them. Let me explain what I mean. Red line number 1. Arms transfers to Ukraine. Broken immediately after the invasion. No MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. Broken within a month. No long-range missiles like the HIMARS-fired Gimlers? Well, we all know that was the story of summer 2022. No Patriot missiles? Broken at the beginning of 2023. No Western soldiers deployed? Keep it quiet, but special forces have been there in non-combat roles. No F-16s? Broken last summer. Remember those Gimler missiles? Well, they are okay, but absolutely nothing with longer ranges. Nope. Enter ATACMS and Storm Shadow. Well, actually, we meant that you cannot fire them into Russian territory. Broken this year. Okay, but you definitely cannot invade Russia. Welcome to Kursk, August 2024. And despite the laundry list that we just went through, all you got there was only a flavor. Many more red lines have been broken over the years. Heck, there is even a Wikipedia page dedicated to the subject. All of this would seem to suggest that red lines do not exist. And while it is true that red lines are silly, red lines are most certainly a thing, and it is the latter group that currently drives American foreign policy thinking. Let me explain the difference, and why these red lines give rise to these red lines. I will illustrate this with the Russia-Ukraine problem because we are more familiar with it, but eventually I will connect it back to Western arms transfers. In coercive diplomacy, the goal is to strategize your way to the outcome that you want. Broadly, you can accomplish this through two means. 1. Negotiations, and 2. War. Unfortunately, absent a world police, sorry United Nations, war is always an option. So if a country is going to follow through on an agreement, at least in the short run, it must reason that the deal is better than what it can expect from war. Let's visualize this. Suppose that this white line represents what Russia anticipates that it can get from war. But war is expensive, and will result in a whole bunch of lives lost. If we convert this into a value of territory, then we can use the space between this white line and this red line to represent the lost value. Note that this is not a red line. It is a red line. It, by definition, is what is minimally acceptable to the party. Obtaining anything less through negotiations will lead to the side in question declaring war. And I do not mean that in the sense of, hey, this time we really mean it. War is going to happen. I mean that war will happen. The game for the opponent, and one that has become increasingly prominent as the talks of negotiations increase, is to figure out exactly where that red line lies. After all, Ukraine wants to keep as much of its land as it can, and settling here looks more attractive than settling way back here. But let's think a little more about how this red line is constructed. Remember, we began by drawing the expected outcome of war. Afterward, we shifted things back by the territorial equivalent of costs paid. Now, I drew the red line here because I needed to draw it someplace, and this was convenient for illustration purposes. But I do not know where the expected outcome of war actually is. It could be here, or here, or here for all I know. And because the red line is a set distance east of the expected outcome, that means I do not know where the associated red line is either. Moreover, even if I knew for sure where the expected outcome was, I still would not know how the Kremlin thinks about the trade-off between land versus money and lives. Part of that calculation would require knowing exactly what is going on inside the head of Putin, which, sorry, but nobody does. Hold on. That is not some flippant comment about Putin. It is a central problem regarding any leader, and people in my field have recognized the headaches that this causes for a long time. In any case, Another part of it is understanding the domestic political risks that the Kremlin faces by continuing the war. That is easier than the prior problem to understand, but still not simple. As a result, holding fixed an expected outcome, Russia's red line could be here, or here, or here, or here. Cases where Putin does not care at all and is politically vulnerable will fall on this end, while this case represents great territorial importance and political stability. Now, governments spend ridiculous sums of money trying to get answers to these questions. Consequently, they have a better idea about what is happening than you or me. But they still do not know, which, mini side rant, is why you should not follow analysis that purports to be able to predict what is going to happen. If Langley does not know, we do not know either. Rather, follow analysis that helps you understand why things are happening, because we are all clueless about the internal machinations of the Kremlin. Anyway, that is how we end up with red lines. It is a game to try to shape the information space. Remember, bargaining has distributional consequences. Ukraine would not want to make concessions out to here when keeping out to here would have been sufficient. In turn, Russia wants to do everything that it can to convince Ukraine that its red line is out to here, even if it is really here. The same is true of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia, except instead of lines on maps, we are talking about lines on a continuum of possible armaments to Ukraine. Not quite as catchy, but let's go with it. The Biden administration would like to increase arms transfers, within reason, whereas the Kremlin would like the opposite. The trade-off for the Kremlin is that being in open conflict with the United States would yield some net level of transfers, but would come at the cost of fighting the world's greatest military power. Despite the risks there, at some point the Kremlin will begin to resist. So, the game for the United States is to figure out how to unlock as much as possible without triggering a meaningful response from Moscow. However, just like the map example, there is the same problem with not knowing exactly where the breaking point is. And also like the territorial situation before it, the United States has some guesses there, but lacks direct knowledge. Hence the formation of those red lines. The Kremlin wants to bluff because if someone believes your bluff, then you will obtain a better outcome. Of course, states understand this incentive and realize that there is very little direct punishment for lying in international relations. Hence, the West has blasted through Russia's alleged red lines, because Western leaders do not believe that they are Russia's actual red line. They think that they are concepts of a red line. Of course, those leaders still do not know where the actual red line is, and they continue to use new information coming in to calibrate their understanding. That, in turn, explains why we keep seeing more red lines laid down, and then subsequently crossed. This is not a new phenomenon, of course, nor is it one that is just limited to Russia. Actually, in Russia, the phenomenon is known as China's final warning, for a Cold War situation where Beijing kept issuing one last notice, only to issue another last notice. You may have heard about this more recently during Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022, and the empty threats from the People's Republic of China that came along with it. Meanwhile, heaven knows how many of Washington's red lines that North Korea has crossed with its nuclear program, or how many of Israel's red lines that Iran has crossed with its nuclear program. But this is the one that is in the news at the moment. The apparent moving target has led to a perception that Russia's actual red line is non-existent, and that the West should just keep pushing. But let's look at what assumptions are necessary for that to be true. For the sake of illustration, suppose that Russia's actual red line could be in one of 5 positions, ranging from light US arms aid to Ukraine at one end, to a NATO invasion of Moscow at the other. It is safe to say that Russia would certainly react to that last option, so the idea that no red line exists at all is silly. Now, as an exercise for yourself, why don't you pause the video for a second? Write out 5 forthcoming potential red lines that matter for wherever the war is as you are watching, and then estimate what you think the probability that each of those red lines is a true red line for Russia. We will see in a moment that the shape of those beliefs has an important implication. But if you are ready, let's continue. As a default, imagine that on the eve of war you thought that each of these true red lines was equally likely. So, at the beginning, you would think that giving aid to Ukraine had a 20% chance of setting off Russia. But if you were to learn that Russia, in fact, was willing to let that go, what is your updated belief that the next rung would set off the Kremlin? Well, it was 20%, but now it's a little more complicated. With 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 20 left over, there is 80% total possibility left, compared to a 20% chance that Gimler's is the true red line. So, 20% divided by 80% gives us 25%. To recap, if we learn that Manpads was not the red line, then each of the remaining possibilities has a 25% chance of being the true one. Thanks, Thomas Bayes. You rule. In other words, the likelihood that the next rung triggers things goes up conditional on the previous rung having not. Thus, observing a red line crossed without consequence ought to impart greater caution on you, not more desire for an assertive policy. That would also be true if the next rung fails to be the true red line, with the subsequent rung jumping to 33.33%, and still true if the one after that fails, jumping to 50%, and then of course the last one must trigger it. Now, it is possible to get more optimistic when a possible red line is revealed to be bluster. For example, if your prior belief put 60% weight on the first rung and 10% on each rung afterward, then learning that the initial 60% guess was wrong means that there is only a 25% chance that the next rung would trigger Russia. That is sharply down from the 60% guess from the initial rung. So here, finding out that Manpads is safe to send would make you want to immediately ship Gimler's too. Now, the initial example is not conclusive evidence that the West would be wrong to keep challenging Russian red lines. The point is that your reaction to the new information depends on whether you had a strong prior belief that Russia would not give an inch. If you did, then that perception has been shattered, and it is time to go further. Moreover, aside from this learning process, as Russia continues to attrit its forces in Ukraine, it becomes increasingly less plausible that Russia has the ability to expand the war. In other words, the true red line probabilities are also drifting to the right over time, and that, in part, explains why Washington is slowly expanding its war aid, even if the conservative pace frustrates those that would prefer a more hawkish strategy. Speaking of hawks, yep, I am ending this video by hawking my books on the war. You can hawk to it by checking the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.